My name is Claire Anderson, and I am 42 years old. I never imagined that my own father, William Anderson, would humiliate me in front of 200 guests at a family wedding. It happened so fast that I still remember the sound of his voice cutting through the laughter and music, changing the mood of the entire room. I was sitting at a corner table, trying not to draw attention, when he stood with his champagne glass and called for silence. I already knew in my gut that this was not going to end well, but I never thought he would turn the spotlight on me the way he did. One moment, the guests were smiling at the bride and groom. The next moment, they were all looking at me. He spoke as if I were a disappointment he had to explain away, and the sting of his words spread through the crowd like fire. I sat frozen, forcing myself not to react, my heart pounding as I realized he had chosen this moment to remind everyone that, in his eyes, I had never measured up. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks as whispers rippled through the tables, and the only thought running through my mind was simple and sharp. How could my father do this to me here, in front of everyone? The reception hall glowed with soft lights. The band played a cheerful tune, and the clinking of glasses carried across the room. Everyone was in high spirits, celebrating Jonathan Reed, the groom, who looked sharp in his navy suit. My father, William Anderson, rose from his chair at the head table, his champagne glass raised high, and the chatter fell into silence, as if on command. He started with words that any father would be proud to speak, praising Jonathan's career as a naval officer. He spoke of honor, bravery, and family tradition, of submarines prowling deep under the ocean, of a young man who had earned his place among the best. I watched Jonathan shift uncomfortably as my father's voice boomed, too polished, too deliberate, like he was setting a trap. Then, with a small twist of his wrist, he redirected the attention toward me. "Now some of you may know my daughter Claire sitting over there," he announced, smiling as he gestured in my direction. My stomach clenched as hundreds of eyes swung toward me, and I tried to keep my face neutral, though the heat in my cheeks betrayed me. "She likes to tell people she works in the Navy, too," he added, his tone dripping with something between sarcasm and pity. A few chuckles rippled through the guests, though most looked confused, caught between politeness and curiosity. My cousin's radiant smile faltered as she glanced at me with sympathy, but my father pushed forward with his performance. In reality, she works a desk job on base, filing papers, pushing pens, keeping herself busy with the small stuff. He said it as if he were clarifying a joke, a detail that needed to be corrected so the groom's glory could shine even brighter. I sat frozen, my throat dry, wishing the floor would open up beneath me. It didn't stop there. My aunt, already half drunk, leaned in loud enough for people around us to hear. "Didn't she drop out of the academy?" she asked, her words coated with gossip. My father nodded, his face etched with disappointment that I had known my whole life. "That's right. Couldn't handle the pressure. We had such high hopes, but she wasn't cut out for military life." The words landed like knives. My chest tightened as I forced myself to stay still, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing me react. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind napkins, avoiding my eyes, but no one stepped in to stop him. He was the patriarch, the respected elder, and his voice carried the weight of authority. I watched Jonathan's posture stiffen, his polite smile fading into something darker, though my father was too busy relishing his own story to notice. "At least she found steady work somewhere," he concluded, raising his glass once more. "Even if it's not what we imagined for her." The crowd hesitated, then echoed his toast in a murmur that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, the image of composure, while inside I was unraveling. Every sentence had dragged me deeper into shame, stripping away years of service and sacrifice with a few careless phrases. It was not the first time he had diminished me, but it was the first time he had chosen to do it so publicly, with a smile on his face and pride in his voice. In that moment, surrounded by family and strangers alike, I felt the sharp sting of betrayal. My father had reduced my life to a punchline, a cautionary tale, and there was nothing I could do but swallow the humiliation while the room carried on as if nothing had happened. The band picked up the music again, people returned to their meals, and I sat in silence, suffocating under the weight of my father's words. As the noise of the reception swelled again and laughter filled the hall, I debated leaving early, my pride shredded and my patience gone. That was when Jonathan Reed appeared at my side, his expression calm but his eyes restless. He leaned closer, speaking low enough that only I could hear, and addressed me in a way that stopped my breath. "Commander Anderson," he said with careful respect. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, but the formality in his tone was unmistakable. My heart skipped as I turned to face him, searching for any hint of mockery, but he looked serious. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice thin with disbelief. Jonathan straightened, his posture betraying the discipline of years in uniform. "You are Commander Claire Anderson, commanding officer of USS Michigan, aren't you?" The ground beneath me seemed to shift. I felt the blood drain from my face as I struggled to connect this groom in a tuxedo with the professional world I had fought so hard to protect. "How do you know that?" I whispered, almost afraid of the answer. He looked at me as though I were testing him, then nodded slowly. "Because I've sat in briefings with you. I'm the engineering officer on USS Kentucky. We've been working on joint operations for months. I didn't recognize you out of uniform, but when your father mentioned your name, it clicked." My throat tightened. I remembered the countless classified meetings, the hours of preparation, and the weight of responsibility that never left my shoulders. And here was Jonathan, the man my father had paraded as the pinnacle of naval success, standing in front of me, acknowledging my command. The irony pressed down on me like a cruel joke. I shook my head, almost dazed. "Jonathan, my family doesn't know." His brows pulled together. "They don't know? About your command? About the submarine?" His shock was genuine, his voice carrying disbelief. "They think you file paperwork." His words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they were too close to the truth of what my family believed. "I never told them," I admitted quietly. His confusion deepened as he tried to process that answer. "But why?" he pressed. "This is a career most officers would give everything for. You've led missions most of us will never even hear about. You've earned decorations. How can they not know?" His questions pressed against the raw wound I had carried for 2 decades. I turned my eyes back toward the head table, where my father sat laughing with relatives, completely oblivious to the conversation unfolding. "Because my father decided when I was 22 that I was a failure," I said at last, my voice sharper than I intended. "When I graduated from the academy, he said I wouldn't last 6 months. When I finished submarine school, he said I would never make lieutenant. When I was promoted to lieutenant commander, he said I'd hit a ceiling because women couldn't handle command." Jonathan blinked as if I were speaking in another language. "With all due respect, ma'am, that's absurd. You are one of the most respected officers I've ever seen." His insistence only tightened the knot in my chest. I gave a faint smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It doesn't matter. They wouldn't believe me if I told them. They'd call it an exaggeration or a quota." So I stopped trying. He stared at me with something close to anger. Not at me, but for me. "Your father just stood in front of 200 people and told them you're a clerk. And you're not going to correct him?" The intensity of his voice made me flinch. I shook my head slowly. It's easier this way." He ran his hand through his hair, caught between duty and frustration. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the music from the dance floor drifting between us. Then I looked him straight in the eyes. "You want to know why they don't know?" He waited, his jaw tight. "Because they never asked." The words slipped out before I could stop them, raw and heavy. Jonathan inhaled sharply, as if the truth had landed on him like a blow. The silence stretched, filled with everything unspoken. For the first time all night, I felt the weight of my secret shift, just slightly, as if naming it out loud made it real in a way it had never been before. Jonathan's eyes softened, but the tension in his stance remained. He had recognized me when no one else had, and for the first time in years, someone in that room saw me for who I really was. Jonathan's patience snapped like a rope pulled too tight. I watched his jaw set, his shoulders square, and before I could stop him, he was striding across the floor toward the head table. The music and chatter dulled as people noticed his determined walk, forks clinking against plates before falling still. By the time he reached my father, the room had quieted enough for his voice to cut through. "With all due respect, sir," Jonathan said loudly, "there is a serious misunderstanding about your daughter." Every head turned, first to him and then to me. My father blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting a challenge from the very man he had just praised to the heavens. His smile faltered, replaced with confusion that quickly hardened into defensiveness. Jonathan didn't back down. "Claire Anderson is not a clerk. She is Commander Anderson, commanding officer of a Virginia-class submarine. I have served alongside her in joint operations. I have seen her lead sailors with distinction and courage." The words echoed through the hall, and for a split second, no one breathed. The silence broke with a wave of whispers. Chairs scraped as relatives leaned in to confirm what they had heard. My father stood frozen, his champagne glass trembling in his hand, eyes flicking between Jonathan and me, as if trying to rewrite the reality unfolding. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out, just a faint shake of his head. My pulse thundered in my ears. I felt the crushing weight of 200 stares pressing against me, demanding an answer. I rose slowly from my seat, every movement deliberate, my hands steady even though my insides were not. "It's true," I said finally, my voice clear though my chest ached. "I am a submarine commander." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My cousins exchanged stunned looks. My aunts clutched their pearls, and even the bride's smile had vanished into disbelief. My father's face drained of color, as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He whispered my name, but I couldn't tell if it was in shock, anger, or regret. There was no taking it back now. The secret I had carried for decades was out in the open, laid bare under the bright lights of a wedding hall. The guests stared at me like they were seeing a stranger, and my father's expression said everything I had feared. He had never really known me at all. The moment the words left my mouth, the reception hall shifted into chaos. My aunts and uncles spoke over one another, disbelief spilling out in broken questions. "Is this true? Why didn't you tell us? How could we not know?" The bride stared at me with wide eyes, torn between pride and confusion. My father's face had gone pale, his lips opening and closing, as though he were trying to catch up with reality. I stood my ground, every nerve in my body screaming, but my voice steady. "Yes. For 22 years, I have served in the Navy. For 22 years, I have commanded men and women beneath the sea, carrying responsibilities you cannot imagine." I turned to face my father, letting the silence stretch. "And for 22 years, you assumed?" The weight of that accusation hung in the air. My father flinched as if struck, his gaze falling to the floor. "I never meant to doubt you," he muttered. But the words sounded weak, like a man who had built his world on a lie and was watching it crumble. I thought you dropped out." His voice broke on the last word. I shook my head slowly. "You thought wrong. You never asked me. You decided who I was before I had the chance to show you." My chest ached, but I pushed forward because it was the truth I had swallowed for too long. "I carried your disappointment like a shadow, even when I was earning my rank, even when I was leading sailors who trusted me with their lives." Around us, the crowd softened. The whispers that had once carried doubt now carried awe. My cousins, who had smirked earlier, looked at me with something closer to respect. My aunt, the one who had spread the rumor, wiped at her eyes as though she could erase the cruelty of her words. The shift was visible, like a tide turning, and for the first time, I felt their gaze lift me instead of weighing me down. My father looked up finally, his voice breaking. "Claire, I'm sorry. I didn't see you for who you were." The sorrow in his tone reached me, but it did not erase the years. I met his eyes and said the words I had carried for so long. "You assumed for 22 years. The room fell quiet again, and in that silence the truth finally settled where it belonged. When the music picked up again and the guests drifted back to dancing, my father found me outside on the patio. The night air was cool, and for the first time all evening, The noise of the reception felt distant. William stood beside me in silence for a long moment, his hands trembling as he searched for words. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice quiet, stripped of the pride that had always shielded him. "I thought I was protecting you from disappointment, but I see now I was protecting myself from being wrong." The raw honesty in his tone startled me more than his public humiliation had. For the first time, he looked less like the towering figure of my childhood and more like a man afraid of his own failures. I drew in a deep breath, letting the weight of his apology sink in. "I forgave you a long time ago," I told him, my voice even. "The question isn't whether I can forgive you, it's whether you can forgive yourself." He stared at me as though I had spoken in a language he didn't understand, then nodded slowly, as if realizing how heavy that task would be. He whispered, "I don't know how." I met his eyes and answered, "Start by asking questions instead of making assumptions. Start by listening instead of judging. Start by being proud of who I am, not who you thought I should be." My words carried no anger, only the tired truth of 2 decades left unspoken. Jonathan joined us then, his posture still formal, though his face was softer. "Sir," he said to my father, "your daughter is one of the finest commanders in the fleet. Next month, she will be promoted to captain and take command of a new submarine. It would mean a great deal to her crew, and to me, if her family were there." My father's eyes widened, a mixture of pride and regret crossing his face. He turned back to me hesitantly. "Would you want us there, Claire?" His question held none of the arrogance I had grown used to, only a quiet plea. I let the silence stretch before answering. "Yes, but come because you want to know me, not because you want to judge me." His shoulders sagged in relief, and for the first time, he seemed to understand the difference. As the 3 of us stood together beneath the glow of patio lights, I felt a shift inside me. The pain of the evening was still raw, but something else had begun to grow in its place. Hope. My father had finally seen me, and whether he could carry that forward was no longer mine to control. Driving home later, I thought about his question. Why hadn't I ever fought back harder? The answer had crystallized over years of silence, and now I could name it. The most powerful response to being underestimated was not to argue but to succeed. My career, my service, and my command had always spoken louder than any defense I could have given. Tonight, for the first time, the people who mattered most had finally heard it. As I drove home from the wedding, the night felt quieter than usual, almost as if the world itself was giving me space to breathe. For years, I had carried the weight of assumptions, dismissals, and the silence that came from never being believed. That night, in a crowded hall, the truth finally broke through, not because I demanded recognition, but because my work had already spoken louder than words ever could. I realized that the validation of others, even from the people closest to us, is fragile and unpredictable. What truly lasts is the knowledge of who we are and the integrity with which we live. Recognition feels good, but it cannot define us, because our value does not depend on anyone else's approval. The lesson I carry forward is simple but powerful. When people underestimate you, let them. You don't need to fight for their acceptance or bend yourself to fit their vision. Live your truth, do the work, and succeed in silence if you must, because eventually, the truth will rise. And when it does, it will shine brighter than any assumption ever cast over you.